The Johnson family had always been a close-knit and cheerful bunch, but moving to a small town in the heart of the Midwest was a new chapter they were eager to embrace. Marcus Johnson, a towering figure with a warm demeanor, had recently been appointed the new police chief of Meadowbrook, a picturesque town known for its charming streets and tight-knit community. His wife, Linda, a dedicated teacher with a passion for literature, and their two children, 10-year-old Ethan and 8-year-old Sophie, had all agreed that this move was the perfect opportunity to start fresh. The Johnsons had purchased a modest but cozy home on Sycamore Lane, a tree-lined street where every house seemed to have a story. Their new neighbors had watched with curiosity as the moving truck unloaded furniture, boxes, and the barbecue grill that Marcus had insisted on bringing. It was his prized possession, and he saw it as a symbol of the family's unity and love for gathering together. Determined to make a good first impression, the Johnsons decided to host a backyard BBQ the following Saturday. Linda had spent the week meticulously planning the menu, while Marcus had gone around town to personally invite neighbors. "It's a good way to break the ice," he had told Linda, handing out handwritten invitations to everyone on their street. Saturday morning dawned bright and sunny, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of blooming flowers. The Johnsons' backyard was transformed into a welcoming space, adorned with strings of fairy lights and a long table covered in a checkered red and white tablecloth. The smell of charcoal and marinated meat sizzling on the grill wafted through the air, promises of feast to remember. By noon, neighbors began trickling in, each bringing a dish to share. There was a palpable buzz of excitement as people introduced themselves, shaking hands and exchanging warm smiles. Ethan and Sophie, eager to make friends, had set up a lemonade stand and were enthusiastically offering glasses to anyone who approached. The children's laughter mixed with the murmur of adult conversation, creating a lively and inviting atmosphere. Linda's culinary skills were on full display. Platters of juicy burgers, perfectly grilled hot dogs, corn on the cob, and Linda's famous potato salad adorned the table. There was also a vibrant fruit platter, a variety of pies, and pitchers of iced tea and lemonade. Marcus, donning an apron that read "Grill Master," expertly flipped burgers and chatted with guests, his deep laugh echoing across the yard. Most of the neighbors seemed truly delighted by the Johnsons' efforts. They shared stories about Meadowbrook, gave recommendations for local restaurants, and welcomed the family with open arms. However, not everyone was as pleased. At the end of the street, in a pristine white house with an immaculate garden, lived Doris White. Doris, a woman in her late 60s, was known for her meticulous nature and her penchant for peace and quiet. She had lived on Sycamore Lane for over 30 years and took immense pride in maintaining the neighborhood's order. To her, the Johnsons' boisterous BBQ was an unwelcome disruption. From her window, Doris watched the scene unfold with a frown etched deeply on her face. The sound of laughter and music grated on her nerves, and the sight of children running around, leaving footprints on the pristine grass, filled her with dismay. "This is exactly why I prefer quiet things," she asserted to herself, clutching a mug of herbal tea. As the afternoon progressed, Doris's irritation grew. She couldn't understand why the Johnsons felt the need to create such a spectacle. Were they aware of the unwritten rules of the neighborhood? She huffed as she changed at her clock. It was almost 3 p.m., and the party showed no signs of winding down. Back at the BBQ, the Johnsons were oblivious to Doris's discontent. Marcus was in his element, recounting stories from his time as a police officer in the city. Linda was deep in conversation with a group of women who had offered to share tips about the local schools. Ethan and Sophie were playing tag with a gaggle of neighborhood kids, their laughter ringing out like music. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Marcus raised a toast. "To new beginnings and wonderful neighbors," he said, lifting his glass. The crowd erupted in cheers, clinking glasses and echoing his sentiment. It seemed the Johnsons had successfully won over most of their new community. Most, but not all. Doris had finally had enough. The noise, the commotion, and the sight of her neighbors enjoying themselves so freely were too much for her to bear. She picked up her phone and dialed the non-emergency line of the local police department. "Yes, this is Doris White from Sycamore Lane," she began, her voice sharp. "I'd like to report a disturbance." Little did Doris know, her call would set off a chain of events that would not only upend her evening, but also challenge her views about the Johnsons and the community she held so dear. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Doris White found herself growing more agitated with every passing minute. The Johnson family's BBQ had started hours ago, and despite her initial hope that it might wind down quickly, the noise only seemed to grow louder. From her living room window, she could see their backyard illuminated with twinkling lights and filled with laughing neighbors. The sight should have been heartwarming, but for Doris, it was anything but. Doris had always cherished the quiet order of Sycamore Lane. To her, the neighborhood was a sanctuary, a place where the sounds of rustling leaves and birdsong dominated the air. But the Johnsons' arrival had enhanced her peace. The loud voices, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional bursts of laughter grated on her nerves like nails on a chalkboard. She took another sip of her tea, trying to calm herself, but it was no use. "Why can't they be more considered?" she argued. The truth was, Doris had never been good with change. Having lived on Sycamore Lane for over 3 decades, she had seen neighbors come and go, but the Johnsons were different. Their lively personalities and the way they immediately immersed themselves in the community felt intrusive to Doris. She preferred neighbors who kept to themselves, who respected the unspoken rules of maintaining peace and quiet. The Johnsons' enthusiasm felt overwhelming, almost as if they were trying too hard to win everyone over. Her mind wandered back to her late husband, Harold. He had always been the one to mediate and keep her grounded. Harold had loved a good barbecue and would likely have been outside with the Johnsons, chatting and laughing. But Harold was gone now, and the silence she once found comforting had become her only companion. Maybe that was part of the reason why the Johnsons' noise felt so unbearable. It was a reminder of what she had lost. Doris changed at the clock. It was approaching 7 p.m., and the party showed no signs of slowing down. She can hear music now, faint but persistent, accompanied by the occasional cheer. She walked to her front door and opened it, letting the cool evening air wash over her. The sounds from the Johnsons' backyard were even more pronounced outside. She frowned, crossing her arms. "This is ridiculous," she said aloud. "People have to work tomorrow. They should know better." Her irritation turned into a spiral of grievances. She thought about the footprints on the pristine grass of her front yard, left by the neighborhood kids running past earlier. She thought about how one of the children had accidentally thrown a ball into her garden last week, flattening her prized petunias. She even thought about the way Linda Johnson had cheerfully waved at her the other day while walking the dog. It all felt like an invasion of her carefully maintained world. The more she thought about it, the more Doris convinced herself that something had to be done. She couldn't let this continue. The neighborhood had rules, even if they weren't written down. People needed to respect those rules. She picked up her phone and stared at it for a moment, her finger hovering over the keypad. Was she overreacting? No, she decided. This wasn't just about her. It was about preserving the peace and tranquility of Sycamore Lane. With renewed resolution, she dialed the non-emergency line of the local police department. "Yes, this is Doris White from 123 Sycamore Lane," she said, her voice crisp and firm. "I'd like to report a noise disturbance. There's a party going on that's far too loud and has been going on for hours." The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. "Thank you for letting us know, Mrs. White. We'll send someone out to take a look." Doris hung up, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. She changed out the window again, watching as the Johnsons and their guests continued to laugh and chat. They were completely unaware of the storm brewing just a few houses away. Meanwhile, back at the BBQ, the Johnsons were basking in the success of their gathering. Marcus was manning the grill with the ease of a seasoned chef, flipping burgers and chatting with a group of neighbors who seemed genuinely interested in his stories from the police force. Linda was seated with a small circle of women, exchanging recipes and laughing about the quirks of small-town life. Ethan and Sophie had found fast friends among the neighborhood kids and were now engaged in an intense game of hide-and-seek. "This is exactly what we hoped for," Linda said to Marcus as he handed her a newly grilled kebab. "I think we're finally starting to feel at home." Marcus smiled, nodding. "It's a good group of people. I think we made the right choice, moving here." Neither of them had any idea that the phone call Doris had made was already setting things into motion. At the local police station, a pair of officers had been dispatched to respond to the noise complaint. They were given the address and briefed on the situation. "Sounds like your typical neighborhood squabble," one officer remarked as they got into the patrol car. "Let's hope it doesn't escalate." As the officers drove towards Sycamore Lane, the evening air buzzed with anticipation. For Doris, it was a chance to restore order. For the Johnsons, it was a blissful evening of new connections and laughter. Little did they know, their worlds were about to collide in a way that no one could have predicted. The two police officers arrived at Sycamore Lane just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. The sounds of laughter and music grew louder as they parked their patrol car in front of Doris White's house. Doris was already waiting on her porch, her arms crossed, and an air of self-righteous determination about her. "Officers, I'm glad you're here," she said, walking briskly toward them. "It's about time someone did something about this racket. That family has been causing a disturbance all evening. The music, the noise, it's completely unacceptable." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions a mixture of professionalism and mild exasperation. One of them, Officer Reed, nodded. "We'll take a look, ma'am," he said. "Please wait here." Doris watched with satisfaction as the officers walked down the street toward the Johnsons' house. She stood with her hands on her hips, convinced that her complaint would finally bring an end to the chaos. Meanwhile, in the Johnsons' backyard, the party was in full swing. Marcus Johnson stood by the grill, flipping burgers and laughing with a group of neighbors. The scent of grilled meat and barbecue sauce filled the air, mingling with the sound of cheerful chatter. Linda was seated nearby, chatting with a few women about local schools and community events, while Ethan and Sophie ran around with the other kids, their laughter echoing across the yard. When the officers stepped through the gate, their presence immediately drew attention. Marcus looked up from the grill, a friendly smile on his face, but his expression shifted to one of surprise when he recognized them. "Reed, Simmons," Marcus said, setting down his spatula. "What brings you two here?" The officers froze, their eyes widening as they processed the scene. "Chief Johnson?" Officer Simmons stammered, looking between Marcus and the lively gathering. "We didn't realize this was your house." Marcus raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement playing on his face. "Let me guess," he said. "Noise complaint?" Officer Reed nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "Yes, sir. A neighbor called to report a disturbance. We, didn't know it was you hosting the party." Marcus choked, though his tone carried a note of understanding. "Don't worry about it. You're just doing your job. Who called it in?" Reed hesitated, glancing over his shoulder toward Doris's house. "Mrs. White, sir. She was quite adamant about the noise being disruptive." Marcus sobbed, his smile fading slightly. "I see. Well, let's go have a chat with her, shall we?" The officers nodded, relieved to have Marcus take the lead. As they followed him back toward Doris's house, the party guests exchanged curious glances, whispering among themselves about the unexpected interruption. Doris was waiting on her porch, her expression smug as she saw the officers returning with Marcus in tow. She didn't seem to notice his badge or the authoritative way he carried himself. Instead, she launched into a tirade the moment they were within earshot. "I'm glad you've finally decided to address this," she said, her voice sharp. "That noise has been unbearable. It's completely disrespectful to the neighborhood." Marcus held up a hand, his calm demeanor unshaken by her tone. "Mrs. White, I'm Marcus Johnson, the new police chief," he said evenly. "I'm also the one hosting the BBQ." Doris's mouth fell open, her words faltering as she took in the sight of his badge and the officers standing behind him. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words, her indignation replaced by shock. I didn't realize," she began, her voice wavering. "I understand your concerns," Marcus continued, his tone measured. "And I'm sorry if the noise has been disruptive. It was never our intention to cause any inconvenience. We're new to the neighborhood and wanted to get to know everyone. That said, we'll make sure to keep the volume down for the rest of the evening." Doris blinked, clearly taken aback by his polite and professional response. She opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again, seemingly unsure of how to proceed. "If you have any other concerns, please feel free to come talk to me directly," Marcus added, offering a small smile. "We're neighbors, after all." The tension in the air seemed to dissolve as Marcus's words sank in. Doris nodded slowly, her earlier bravado replaced by a hint of embarrassment. "Thank you, Chief Johnson. I appreciate that," she said quietly. Marcus nodded and turned back to the officers. "Thanks for coming out, guys. I've got it from here." Reed and Simmons exchanged a look before nodding. "Of course, Chief. Have a good evening," Reed said. As the officers walked back to their patrol car, Marcus returned to the BBQ, his calm and collected demo intact. The guests greeted him with curious smiles and a few quiet laughs, clearly impressed by how he had handled the situation. Linda placed a hand on his arm, her eyes shining with admiration. "You handled that perfectly," she said. Marcus snapped, a small smile playing on his lips. "Just doing my job," he said, though he couldn't help feeling a sense of satisfaction. The evening might not have gone exactly as planned, but it had certainly made an impression. On Doris, on the neighbors, and even on his own family. The next morning, Marcus Johnson stood at his kitchen counter, staring at a steaming cup of coffee, as the events of the previous evening replayed in his mind. The BBQ had ended peacefully, but Doris White's frustration lingered in his thoughts. He decided it was time to address the situation directly and find a way to ease the tension between his family and their neighbors. "Linda," he said, turning to his wife, who was slicing fruit for breakfast. "I'm going to talk to Mrs. White today. I think it's important we clear the air." Linda looked up. She expressed a mix of surprise and approval. "That's a good idea. She seems like she's been through a lot, even if she's a bit prickly." "Prickly is an understatement," Marcus said with a wry smile. "But everyone has their reasons. I want to understand hers. Later that morning, Marcus walked across the street and knocked on Doris's door. The sound of shuffling footsteps preceded her appearance. She opened the door just enough to peer out, her face guarded. "Chief Johnson," she said. Her tone was neutral but wary. "What brings you here?" "Good morning, Mrs. White," Marcus replied, his voice steady and warm. "I wanted to apologize again for any disruption we caused last night, and to talk, if you're open to it." Doris hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as she considered his words. Finally, she sobbed and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. The inside of her home was immaculate, with neatly arranged furniture and shelves lined with framed photos. Marcus noticed one picture in particular, a younger Doris standing beside a man in uniform, both of them smiling brightly. "Is that your husband?" Marcus asked, gesturing to the photo. Doris's expression softened, and she nodded. "Yes, Harold. He was a police officer too. Lost him nearly 10 years ago." "I'm sorry for your loss," Marcus said sincerely. "He looks like a good man." "He was," Doris said, her voice tinged with emotion. "And he loved this neighborhood. We used to host BBQs just like yours. The kids will play, and Harold will grill while I make lemonade. It was our way of bringing people together." Marcus listened intently, sensing the layers beneath her words. "It sounds like wonderful memories," he said. "I can see why it's hard to watch new people come in and change things." Doris looked away, her eyes glistening. "It's not just that," she admitted. "After Harold passed, the neighborhood started to feel different. People moved away, new families came in, and it wasn't the same. I feel like I was losing the place we built together." "Change is never easy," Marcus said gently. "But it doesn't mean we can't create new connections. My family and I moved here because we wanted to be part of a community, not disrupt it." Doris's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't interrupt. Marcus took the opportunity to continue. "I know last night was loud, and I understand why it upset you," he said. "But our goal wasn't to intrude. It was to get to know our neighbors and show that we're here to contribute, not take away." For a moment, the room was silent, except for the faint ticking of a clock. Then Doris spoke, her voice quieter now. "You remind me of Harold," she said. "He had that same way of talking, making people feel heard." Marcus smiled. "That's a high compliment. Thank you." Doris sobbed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Maybe I've been too quick to judge," she admitted. "It's just hard to let go of the past." "I understand," Marcus said, "but maybe we can find a way to honor the past while embracing the present. My family would love to get to know you better, Mrs. White. You have so much history here, and we'd be grateful to learn from it." Doris looked at him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "All right, Chief Johnson. Let's see what we can do." Over the following weeks, the Johnsons made a concerted effort to include Doris in their lives. They invited her over for quiet dinners, asked her advice on gardening, and even suggested she help plan a neighborhood block party. Slowly but surely, Doris began to open up, her guarded demeanor softening as she realized the Johnsons truly cared. One afternoon, as Doris watched Ethan and Sophie play in her yard, she turned to Marcus and Linda. "You know," she said, "Harold would have liked you. He always believed in giving people a chance." "That means a lot," Linda said warmly. "We're glad to have you as our neighbor, Doris." Doris smiled, a genuine smile that seemed to erase years of sadness. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of belonging, not just to the neighborhood, but to the people who had become her friends. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was real. The Johnsons and Doris found common ground, proving that even the deepest misunderstandings could be overcome with patience, empathy, and a willingness to connect. And on a quiet summer evening, as Marcus fired up the grill and Doris brought over her famous lemonade, Sycamore Lane felt like home again. In the weeks that followed Marcus's heartfelt conversation with Doris White, a quiet but profound transformation began to take shape. The once reclusive and guarded neighbor, who had been defined by her stern demeanor and sharp words, began to emerge from the cocoon of her past. It began preparing, with Doris accepting an invitation from the Johnsons to join them for a small community garden project. Marcus had approached her one afternoon while she was tending her immaculately trimmed rose bushes. "Mrs. White," he said, holding a flyer, "we're organizing a community garden day next Saturday. We could really use someone with your experience. Linda mentioned your roses are the talk of the neighborhood." Doris's cheeks flushed slightly at the compliment. She hesitated, looking at the flyer, but eventually nodded. "All right, Chief Johnson. I suppose I can spare a morning." The event was a turning point. Neighbors who had only known Doris as the lady with the strict rules saw a different side of her. She shared gardening tips, complimented a young couple on their enthusiasm, and even helped a group of children plant sunflowers. The Johnsons had quietly orchestrated the event to foster connections, and their efforts were paying off. Doris's participation didn't go unnoticed. Over time, she found herself invited to more meetings, a book club hosted by Linda, an informal coffee morning with other neighbors, and even a charity bake sale. Each small step was a victory, not only for Doris, but for the community. Marcus, ever the community builder, decided to host a neighborhood meet and greet at the Johnson home. The invitation was extended to every house on Sycamore Lane, and the event promised to be a celebration of unity and shared stories. The evening of the event, the Johnsons' backyard was a scene of warmth and laughter. Strings of fairy lights twinkled overhead, and tables were laden with potluck dishes contributed by the neighbors. Marcus stood by the grill, his apron reading "Grill Sergeant," while Linda flitted between guests, making sure everyone felt welcome. Doris arrived, carrying a tray of her famous lemon bars. She was greeted with smiles and warm hellos. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like an outsider. As the night progressed, Marcus called for everyone's attention. "I just want to thank you all for being here tonight," he began. "Linda, the kids, and I moved here because we wanted to be part of a community, and you've all made us feel so welcome. But tonight isn't just about us. It's about celebrating what makes Sycamore Lane special, the people who live here." The crowd erupted into applause, and Doris found herself clapping along, a genuine smile on her face. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Doris approached Marcus and Linda. Her usually stern face was soft with emotion. "Chief Johnson, Linda," she began, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "I owe you both an apology. When you first moved in, I wasn't fair to you. I let my own fears and sadness cloud my judgment. But you've shown me that change doesn't have to be scary, and that there's still room for connection and joy in this world." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Mrs. White, it takes courage to say that, and I respect you for it. We're grateful to have you as our neighbor." Linda chimed in, "And as our friends." Doris's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you. That means more than you know." From that day forward, Doris was no longer the distant figure behind the immaculate lawn. She became an integral part of the Sycamore Lane community. She organized events, shared her wisdom, and even took on the role of honorary grandmother to Ethan and Sophie, who adored her stories and her endless supply of lemon bars. The Johnsons' arrival had sparked a renewal on Sycamore Lane, not just for Doris, but for the entire neighborhood. The lesson was clear. Patience, empathy, and a willingness to connect could bridge even the deepest divides. On a crisp autumn evening, as Marcus fired up the grill and neighbors gathered for another backyard BBQ, Doris sat in her favorite chair, watching the scene with contentment. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. Sycamore Lane wasn't just a place. It was home, filled with laughter, understanding, and the bonds of community. And as the sun set over the neighborhood, Doris raised a glass of lemonade and toasted quietly to herself. To new beginnings.